Mei Mei, speak more Chinese.
I'm a blended fourth-generation Australian Chinese migrant. What does that mean to me? It means I feel I can't be myself. My life is a tug-of-war. That's because my family in Australia, on my mother's side, is a complicated mix of twists and turns. My great-grandfather arrived on the Queensland goldfields at Charters Towers in the 1870s. He supplied miners with donkeys, buckets and Bibles. After making money in hardware, he went back to China to look for a bride, and he came back with my great-grandmother, who bore him 10 children. My grandfather George was the eldest. He was born in the small town of Croydon in Queensland. He grew up speaking English with an Australian accent. At the age of 13, he was sent back to China for a period to learn Chinese, so he could better communicate with his parents. My grandfather George married my grandmother Ivy. They had 2 children. My mother was their eldest. She was born in the small town of Ayr, in the sugarcane growing region of Queensland. My mother grew up as a dinky-die Aussie. She couldn't speak Chinese. My grandmother Ivy couldn't speak English. I was stuck in the middle. I was the mediator, the go-between. I was born in Chicago, but grew up in Hong Kong. My mother didn't teach me any English when I was in Hong Kong. She insisted that I speak Chinese.
Mei Mei, speak more Chinese.
So when I came to Australia in 1975, I spoke only Cantonese. I was called Bronwyn. I used my English name, and I worked hard to learn English. I was excited to be an Australian. Life was sweet, full of possibilities. But not long after, a sour taste entered my mouth. Just before primary school ended, my mother told me she had enrolled me in secondary school using my Chinese name. I would now be called Bon-Wai. Why, I thought? Aren't I meant to be Australian? But my mother kept repeating,
Mei Mei, speak more Chinese.
The more my mother repeated, speak more Chinese, the more I felt I'd been subjected to a nasty trick. I felt like a tiger raised in a zoo, imprisoned, with no opportunity to break out of jail. It's all very well my mother telling me to speak Chinese when she didn't have to. I wasn't happy. Nothing made sense. Until one day I stumbled across a pile of letters written by my grandfather George in Townsville to my mother in Brisbane. The letters were written in the most exquisite Abraham Lincoln-style handwriting, full of instructions like,
Remember to give mooncakes to Young Fung when you see her. Have you opened that safe deposit box yet? I'm telling you, wearing high heels is dangerous.
I was surprised they were the same instructions I'd grown up with, the same rules and etiquettes, emphasising survival, endurance and perseverance. My grandfather's letters were written in the late 1950s and early 60s to my 20-something-year-old mother, a science graduate from the University of Queensland. It was the age of rock and roll, modern home appliances and sliding glass doors, but it was obvious from the letters my grandfather was stuck, still living the hard times on the goldfields. I was intrigued by one letter. It had splotches of tears. My mother had been crying. It said, We have had many talks over the difficulties you would encounter if you choose Mervyn as an ideal husband. Mervyn mixes mostly with Australians. Your children will grow up with a purely Australian outlook and no vestige of Chinese. Who's Mervyn, I thought. I find out Mervyn is a young medical student, a third-generation Australian Chinese like my mother. His family was from Darwin. To me, my mother and Mervyn would make a good match, but not according to grandfather George. He told my mother it would pay her to hold off her engagement and make a trip over to Hong Kong and see what other opportunities she may find. There's no need to make hasty decisions, he said. If Mervyn's very earnest, he can afford to wait 12 months or even 2 years. To put it this way, he said, neither you nor Mervyn can speak Chinese to any extent. If you happen to have children, they will in turn know absolutely nothing. I had no idea my mother was in serious trouble prior to meeting my father, and the cause of her trouble was because she couldn't speak Chinese. I knew my grandfather George and my grandmother Ivy had sacrificed everything to give my mother a solid education. They had worked long hours running their mixed grocery business in Townsville, but my mother regretted they never prioritised teaching her Chinese.
Mei Mei, speak more Chinese.
Now sounded like a cry for help, an anthem of ancestral pain. My mother didn't want the responsibility of raising a daughter who would go through what she'd gone through. My mother did make that trip to Hong Kong in the end, where she ended up staying and met my father, who was a doctor and a Chinese scholar, fluent in 4 Chinese dialects. They married and had 3 children. My father passed away in 2005. Then out of the blue on New Year's Eve 2020, my mother, now aged 83, receives a telephone call from Mervyn, aged 86. It's as if the universe had arranged for this strange and inevitable union to continue with no blame and no hurt feelings. My mother and Mervyn never met again, but I've come to know myself. I'm no longer trapped by the same rules and expectations. I'm free to speak Chinese. I'm free to speak English. I'm free to be me.